Autopsy Doctors of Reddit. What was strangest discovery you've made while performing an autopsy? Undiagnosed widespread metastasized cancer in a college kid that had died in a bar fight gone bad. It's one of the small mysteries of my career thus far that has stuck with me. The primary mystery being how it could be that he wouldn't have noticed his condition or sought medical attention prior to his death. This was not some mere colon polyp. It was everywhere. I've had other instances before and since where you find the second place cause of death that didn't get to have its moment. Certainly a lot of older people have a thing or two in the works, but that was definitely the strangest instance of that concept. I can speak a bit to that one. When I was in college, it became apparent to me that I was very ill. I was also about to age off of my parents' health insurance, and many of the likely causes of my symptoms were going to render me uninsurable once diagnosed, so I opted to be assessed for the few contenders that would be easy cures. When all of those tests were negative, I opted to ignore it. After college, I was waiting for a full-time job with benefits to begin. It was obvious that I was very sick, but because I was still on my parents' policy, I was determined to just keep going until my job could start. I learned that I could treat most symptoms with hard physical labor, so I divided my days between working fire, EMS responses, and the gym. But 2 weeks before I was going to get that golden insurance of my own, I collapsed, vomiting blood. Woke up a couple weeks later, a couple states away, on a ventilator. Cause number 4 on my list, brain cancer, was the winner, and I was very fortunate to have lived at all. Worst part, going back to the past. Given those circumstances, I would have made the same decision to avoid getting diagnosed. Funny note, when you wake up in intensive care, they ask you why you're there. Other sound contenders that I guessed included the time that a ceiling collapsed on me during a house fire, an impatient driver decided to plow through the scene of a wreck that I was cutting, a drunk redneck pulling out a gun. It was indeed all rather Final Destination. This is fascinating. Was it a form of cancer that metastasizes rapidly? Have ye access to medical histories of the people you deal with? Then, it sounds as if you do, and so would know if he ever consulted a doctor about what would have been symptoms of the cancer. It would be nice to know whether others noticed recent signs of pain, decreased mobility, whether he'd ever mentioned for example having backaches that would wake him at night, things which of course you can't know. Have you any explanations? Is it really possible for cancer so widely disseminated to be asymptomatic? Never underestimate a human's denial, or unwillingness to see a doctor. When I was 21 or so, I randomly started having chest pain. Me being me, didn't want to bother anyone. Was dealing with depression at the time as well, so I said fuck it. Ended up literally on the floor in the fetal position due to pain, waiting for the inevitable heart attack from 7 p.m. till 9 a.m. the next morning. Finally, with having enough of the pain, I went to the who took care of me. Long story short, was a gallbladder issue, nothing heart-related, but could have been much worse if not. People don't like the doctors sometimes, and will do anything they can to avoid them. It's possible he knew and was either too afraid or too stubborn to seek treatment. My uncle died of cancer. By the time it was diagnosed it was inoperable and he was given weeks to live as it was already in every part of his body. He died 3 weeks later. He'd survived cancer years before and declared he would not put himself through chemo again. We're convinced he knew what it was and just kept quiet about it. He must have been in considerable pain before finally going to the emergency room. That was almost my ex-husband. We split custody and for the only time ever I used our daughter. Told him I was going to take him to court for her if he didn't go to the doctor. He was in his mid-30s and exceptionally healthy, but I noticed he looked a lot more tired and he had told me there was blood in his stool. They had checked for hemorrhoids and found nothing. Did a scan and all they found was a calcified lymph node in his pelvis. So he thought he wasn't sleeping well and eating too many spicy food. I thought the worst, so I threatened him. Then I went to the doctor with him for his colonoscopy. Stage 3 colon cancer. He has familial adenomatous polyposis. Spontaneous mutation, saw no family history. Our daughter is 20 and has a more advanced case. My ex had a lot of tumors in weird places and was colon looked like a shag rug with a big tumor near the rectum. Wonder if that is what that college kid had? Really sad stuff. So young. Edit, otherwise known as Gardner syndrome. I've seen bone cancer that spread to a young person's lung, which basically replaced the whole lung with bone. I had to saw the lung in half with a bone saw to get samples. Another lady with cirrhosis died, and when she arrived she had a distended belly. We assumed it was due to ascites secondary to her cirrhosis, but when we opened her abdomen, this thick, clear, gelatinous mucus poured out. We measured it at over 2 liters of this sticky gel. Turns out she had an undiagnosed mucinous tumor of her ovary, which had spread all throughout her abdomen. Icky. When I was a med student, our cadaver had a thumb-sized lump in his scrotum. I thought we'd discover a tumor. When I dissected and cut open the scrotum, there was a plastic object. It turned out to be a penile implant. Our professor had me dissect the entire implant out, and everyone else went to our table and I had to show them the entire contraption. Reservoir, cylinders and all. I was later called the penile implant guy. No, I didn't become a urologist. When I was in EMS training, we had to do ME rotations to learn gross anatomy. The ME told us of a case they had the previous month where they had an unattended death in a rental property of a single 40-something person with no known medical history. Autopsy was unremarkable until the labs came back. Carbon monoxide poisoning. They reported it back to the police, who investigated. Turned out his heating system had a weird malfunction that would emit massive amounts of CO. In this case, the autopsy saved someone else's life as the heating system was fixed to avoid it from potentially killing the next renter. I'm not an autopsy doc, I'm a writer. Dragon Con used to have a program where the state coroner for GA would come in and basically play guess how they died with pictures of bodies that he had received. Being a horror writer, I went regularly. Most memorable one for me was a torso and lower jaw, no signs of injury other than the remainder of the skull being absent. Turns out the poor guy had been changing a tire alongside 285. He stood up just as a truck went by. Truck passenger had their feet sticking out the window and accidentally kicked the guy's head off. Passenger had severely broken legs. I saw that picture in 1995 and it still bothers me. Back in gross anatomy, I was cutting into my guy's butt. This guy had so much fat. If you didn't know, fat is yellow. I finally separate the sea of yellow from his red muscles, and as I'm parting his muscles I see more yellow deep in his glutamus maximus. I'm thinking, WFT is this? How the FK does this guy have fat under his muscles? I pull it out and it ended up being a massive lipoma. Could easily fill a C cup. But don't think that's why he died. His lungs were pretty f***ed up, so I think he was a smoker. Not my personal story, but when I was in my intro to EMS class, my teacher brought in a death investigator, former autopsy examiner, to speak to our class. She told us while she worked as an autopsy examiner she got this woman who at the time mysteriously suffocated after a car accident. Apparently this woman was driving, and while she was driving she grabbed her lighter from her purse and was holding it in her mouth while she fumbled through her bag for her cigarettes. While doing this she got T-boned. The airbag went off, and on the way to hospital they kept trying to put tubes down her throat to open her airway cause she was having trouble breathing. But no luck. She said when they cut open her throat during the autopsy they found her lighter jammed down there. Apparently when the airbag went off it got jammed down her throat and no one knew. Not a doctor, autopsy tech, nothing particularly strange, mostly suicides and natural deaths. The strange thing is when you start working there suddenly all the patients are around your age. It's just coincidence but feels freaky. I was 19 and had several cases that were under 21, luckily never any kids. One guy died behind the wheel and crashed into a Cadillac dealership. Ended up totaling several cars. Listen to your doctor if they tell you to do something, like walking after a bone break. If you sit on a chair and never walk you could end up with a blood clot that breaks off and kills you via pulmonary embolism. Person had several thumb-sized DVTs in her calves and one in the lung. Also don't be afraid to get help if you're suffering. Suicide isn't the answer. Not a doctor, autopsy tech. I think it surprises people to find out that the people doing the autopsies are not doctors. There's the doctor there usually, sometimes just at the end, but it's done by someone with a job title like yours who at most has to complete the technical qualification. Not belittling, I know how hard this job is, my partner did it for a long time. Sometimes help isn't the answer though. I've tried just about every way of getting help that there isn't. Each and every one has come back to bite me in the ass. I'm too lazy, weak to kill myself, many failed attempts can attest to that. So I'm just slowly moseying my way through life, waiting for the day I get hit by a bus or something. Man, it'd be pretty awkward to wind up on your autopsy table now lol. Not a doctor or autopsy tech, but I am a funeral director, embalmer. In school we went to a cadaver lab that has about 8 bodies, all preserved and pre-dissected in various ways. One was dissected right down the middle, a table of just a bunch of limbs, etc. There was one decedent who had situs inversus, which means that their inside structure in their torso and abdomen are on the opposite side of the normal positioning. This was discovered in this person's life because they went in for an appendectomy and the doctors started looking around on the right side and couldn't find anything, looked on the left side and there was the appendix. It's a genetic mutation, and most people who have it don't actually know they have it, as it wouldn't pose any health issues. My dad was the doc tasked by the county to perform autopsies. He probably did over 100 in his career. He eventually quit because of how gruesome the job was. Children dying in a house fire, suicides with a gun to the head, torn limbs from farming accidents, etc. He smelled terrible for days after coming home due to the formaldehyde. After a while that kinda job catches up. One weird case he had was a man was sitting in his pickup truck and a stray hunting bullet went through his window, through his gut, and out the other side. Dude bleed out on sight. I've had the opportunity to attend a couple of autopsies. One thing I will never forget is the first time you see them put the scalpel in to make the initial wide cut that goes from the clavicle to the pubis. It's such a strange sight to see someone nonchalantly stick a knife into someone's skin so deeply and cut like it's going through butter. And the fact that there is no blood makes it all that much more strange. It's also strange to see the food that the decedent ate. It stops digesting, so if they had just eaten shortly before death, you get some interesting stuff. One person had been at a party and ate potato salad but had clearly just kind of gulped it down. Big chunks of unchewed food that you could have put into a container and no one would have even known it was actually consumed already. When they got the tree loppers out to cut the rib cage open, that was another treat. Totally unexpected. It wasn't an actual tree lopper, but it was the exact nomenclature of one. Just a little shinier and seemed to be a lot better built. I met a medical examiner at a friend's party recently, and he told us that once he received the body of the cheese factory worker who fell and drowned, burned in molten cheese. It was super awkward as the corpse they received was embedded in a chunk of cheese as it had cooled down. Felt like carving out a corpse from the leftovers of a fondue, French molten cheese dish. It was his top one. Not human corpses, but did a few necropsies on animals and found some odd stuff. Majority of it was cancer, heart failure, or odd accidents. Very rarely was it something horrifying. Had a cat that only was born with one kidney and it was too small. Looked like it stopped developing while young. Had a dog that best described looked like a train wreck. It had multiple surgeries from swallowing random objects and did a number on the digestive tract when it got older. Could see where intestine and multiple spots were removed and put together again. Had a tortoise have hay shoved up its nose and best described only one functional nostril. It was completely blocked the body in case the foreign object. It passed from poor nutrition. Had a bird managed to swallow a squeaker from a dog toy. Not sure how no one noticed that. Fish also will swallow anything. Top 5 were, ping pong balls, those small solider figures, a ballpoint pen, small Christmas ornament, and a fake rose. Med student here. The cadaver we were dissecting lacked a muscle called the palmaris longus. For those not familiar, it's the most superficial muscle of the forearm. You can see it as cord-like structure in your wrist that rises when you try to make a claw with your hand. On dissecting the other limb, we discovered that the agenesis was bilateral. Where I'm from, the first part we dissect is the upper limb, so usually during this stage students are pretty inexperienced and haven't yet been exposed to a lot of variations in the body, so discovering this was quite fascinating. Later on, when we reached the thorax, we also found that he had 3 lobes in his left lung and 2 in his right. Usually the opposite is found. Not a doctor but at an autopsy have had to ask if we measure the decedent from top of head to soles of feet. How do I measure someone without a head? Ended up using the height on his driver's license with a notation on Y. Also, not strange, but oftentimes if you don't use a large enough caliber the bullet just bounces around in your skull. Usually you deer after a bit, not almost instantly. But the number of suicides where the person has already attempted suicide by GSW to the head and lived was shocking. No head dude mentioned had already tried once with tiny bullet and just mostly damaged the sides of his head and needed plastic surgery. Clearly he picked the larger size his next attempt. We had this guy who had some heart issues. Came to the hospital with some heart failure symptoms, got progressively worse and then just couldn't go anymore. This guy had extensive imaging, testing, the whole deal. Well, when we were doing the organs, everything looked fairly okay. Even the heart didn't look that bad for the picture they gave us. Then, I slice open the liver, which was admittedly a bit larger than normal, and boom, it was about 80% replaced by a nasty abscess. I'm talking liters of pus. He didn't have a fever. They didn't see anything on imaging, clinical or even blood cultures. We were never sure if the heart issues were maybe worsened before he got to become septic, but that is still the largest liver abscess I've seen in my life. Just a bit ago, I was in a human anatomy class where they worked with cadavers. The one my class worked on died due to heart issues. What exactly they said, I don't really remember now. However, when we cut open the thorax and abdomen to get to the GI tract and heart and lungs, a tumor had grown in the mesentery of the small intestine and lived in its own pocket, pushed and pierced through the diaphragm, and squished up near the heart. Looks like it was a misdiagnosis that ended up taking her life. The doctors were close, but it looks like they never got around to seeing if she had any tumor issues. Autopsy tech. We had a guy a few months ago that was putting off going to the hospital. Died in the car on a road trip. Anyway, his right lung and liver were decomposing. He had this really nasty pus in his right shoulder too. We were calling him Zombie Guy. But a guy who was speeding on his motorcycle, bounced off a semi and slammed into a stop sign. Internal decapitation. That was pretty cool. My friend had 2 cases in a row that had axillary spleens. Someone tell me the odds. I can't math. Nothing to do with my previous post, but I once dated a mortuary tech, an undertaker, and she said the weirdest thing she ever encountered was that organs can shift in a human body. Or maybe I am not remembering it correctly and it was a case where the person was born with mirror organs. Also on a side note, she had a really killer sense of humor. The only reason we are not together today is that her fiancé didn't approve. LOL. Once, I sent a cow for autopsy after it died suddenly. The report came back that there was a wire in its heart, not hugely uncommon, they worked through from the digestive tract, but also that this cow had a deflated football in its stomach which had been there for some time and did not appear to hinder digestion. Know someone who at least had his appendix on the wrong side. It was back in a time before MRI machines, so the doctor rummaged around looking for the appendix for a few hours until he finally found it. As a student in dental school gross anatomy lab. We were dissecting the throat. Upon entering the larynx we discovered a tooth the PT had swallowed. The tooth was lodged over epiglottis and we got to change the cause of death to choked on foreign substance. All cadavers were treated with the utmost respect. Suicide can and should be for some people, chronic pain sufferers and those with chronic Medication-resistant mental illness come to mind for those that should be able to choose suicide for themselves. I've worked with psychiatric patients for a long time and feel strongly about this.